Elena Voss had learned, over 3 quiet years at the Calloway estate, that the safest thing a person could be was invisible. She kept her head down. She did her work well. She asked no questions about the tall iron gates at the edge of the property, or the guards who sometimes appeared at night and vanished by morning, or the little boy in the East Wing, who was never spoken of at the dinner table. His name was Kai. He was 5 years old, with dark curly hair and eyes that seemed too old for his face. When Elena had first been assigned to care for him, she was told only that he was a distant relative, orphaned young, and that the family had taken him in out of kindness. She had believed it, mostly because she had no reason not to. People took in children sometimes. It happened. What she noticed, in the months that followed, had nothing to do with bloodlines or secrets. It had to do with the fact that Kai flinched at sudden noises, that he refused to sleep unless a lamp stayed on in the corner of his room, that he sometimes woke in the night calling for a mother he did not seem to remember, and a father he had never met. Elena did not need to know the truth to know that this child needed someone, so she became that someone. She read him stories until her voice went hoarse. She sat outside his door on the nights he was afraid, humming softly until his breathing evened out. She learned which foods made him smile, and which songs made him laugh, and slowly, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, Kai stopped being an assignment and became, simply, hers to protect. The Calloway estate itself was strange in ways Elena chose not to examine too closely. The staff spoke in careful voices whenever the topic of the family up north came up. Mrs. Calloway's sister-in-law, a sharp, unpleasant woman named Priscilla, who ran the household with icy precision, seemed to hold some private grudge against the arrangement, though she never said what it was. She looked at Kai the way one might look at an inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. Elena told herself it wasn't her business. She was there to care for a little boy, not to untangle the politics of a family she barely understood. That was the story she told herself, right up until the night of the storm. It began, as these things often do, with warning signs that nobody took seriously enough. The weather service had been calling for heavy rain for days, nothing unusual for the season. But that afternoon, the staff noticed something else. Unfamiliar cars parked along the tree line at the edge of the property, gone by the time anyone thought to mention them. Priscilla grew tense and short-tempered. The head groundskeeper doubled the perimeter checks without explanation. Even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. By evening, the rain had turned into something closer to a siege. Thunder cracked hard enough to rattle the windows. The power flickered once, twice, and then held, though barely. Elena had just gotten Kai down for the night in the guest cottage, a smaller building near the main house, used for storage more than anything, though it had a bed and a fireplace, and had become, in recent weeks, Kai's preferred place to sleep, since he said the walls felt safer there. She was banking the fire when she heard raised voices near the main house. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw the staff being ushered inside in a hurry, doors bolting behind them one by one. She waited for someone to come get her and Kai. No one did. She tried the cottage door. Locked from some outside mechanism she'd never noticed before. She tried her phone. No signal, the storm having taken the nearest tower down with it. She banged on the door and called out, but the wind swallowed her voice before it could travel far, and the rain hammered too loud for anyone in the main house to hear a woman shouting from 50 yards away. Later, she would learn that Priscilla had made the call to lock the outer doors the moment she saw the strangers near the property line, prioritizing the safety of the main house and leaving the guest cottage, and whoever was inside it, as an afterthought. Whether it was panic or something colder, Elena never got a clear answer. In that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that she and Kai were alone, and something was moving through the trees. She saw them before she heard them, 3 shapes at the edge of the tree line, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with the storm. Kai stirred in his sleep, sensing something in the room's tension shift, waking half frightened before he even opened his eyes. "Miss Ellie?" His voice was small, buried under the sound of rain on the roof. "I'm here." She kept her tone even, though her heart was slamming against her ribs. "I need you to do something for me. Can you hide under the bed, sweetheart? Quiet as a mouse. Don't come out until I say so, no matter what you hear." He didn't argue. Something in her voice must have told him this wasn't a game. He slid under the bed frame and pulled his knees to his chest, and Elena grabbed the only weapon she could find, a heavy iron poker resting by the fireplace, and positioned herself between the bed and the door. The lock gave way faster than she expected. Splintered wood, a gust of wind and rain, and then 3 figures stepped into the cottage, moving with an unnatural quiet that made the hair on Elena's arms rise. She would think, much later, that there had been something wrong about the way they moved, something too smooth, too coordinated, like predators rather than people. In the moment, all she registered was danger, close and immediate, standing between her and the child she had sworn to protect. "Get out," she said, raising the poker, her voice shaking but not breaking. "Get out of here right now." One of them, the tallest, with cold, pale eyes that seemed to catch what little light there was, smiled, unbothered by the sight of a woman half his size, holding a fireplace tool like a sword. "We're not here for you," he said. "Step aside." No. She didn't know where the strength came from. She was not brave by nature. She had spent 3 years making herself small and quiet, precisely because she preferred to avoid confrontation of any kind. But there was no version of herself, in any life, that could step aside and let harm reach that child. So she stood her ground, poker raised, screaming into the storm for help she wasn't sure would ever come. What Elena didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the child she was protecting was not simply an orphaned relative taken in out of pity. Kai was the son of Julian Ashgrove, a man whose name carried weight and fear in circles far beyond anything the Calloway estate's quiet staff had ever glimpsed. Julian had lost Kai's mother the night the boy was born, and in the chaos and grief that followed, he had made the only choice he could see clearly through his pain: hide his son somewhere safe, somewhere far from the reach of those who would see a fatherless heir as an opportunity rather than a child. The Calloway estate, quiet and unremarkable, had seemed the perfect place. Julian visited rarely, and always without warning, precisely so that no pattern could ever be traced back to the boy. That night, he had come without warning again, driving through the storm because something, instinct, worry, the particular ache that never fully left him when he was away from his son too long, had told him to check. He was still a mile from the estate when he heard it. A scream, carried on wind and rain, in a way that should have been impossible to hear from that distance. But he heard it anyway, sharp and clear and terrified, and something ancient and protective inside him recognized the sound for exactly what it was. Someone in danger, near his son. He did not remember the rest of the drive. He remembered abandoning the car at the gates because it was faster to run, remembered the storm no longer feeling like an obstacle, but like something moving with him rather than against him. He remembered the cottage door hanging open on broken hinges, and the sight that met him when he arrived. Elena Voss, blood on her arm from a cut she hadn't even registered getting, standing over an overturned table she'd used as a barricade, poker still raised, breathing hard, refusing to move even though 2 of the 3 intruders had already backed toward the door, at whatever they'd seen in Julian's approach. The third turned, saw him, and made the wise choice to run before he could reach them. Julian didn't chase them. In that moment, nothing mattered less than 3 strangers fleeing into the storm. What mattered was the woman standing between his son and the door, and the small voice underneath the bed calling out, "Miss Ellie? Are they gone?" "They're gone, sweetheart," Elena said, her voice cracking with relief as she finally let the poker fall from her grip. "You can come out now." Kai scrambled out and threw himself into her arms, and Elena knelt there in the wreckage of the cottage, holding him, whispering that everything was okay, that she had him, that nothing was going to hurt him. She did not immediately notice Julian standing in the doorway. When she did look up, soaked and trembling and utterly unprepared for what she saw, she found a man staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and a gratitude so raw it looked almost like pain. "Who are you?" she asked, because in the chaos of the moment, some part of her brain still needed the world to make sense. "I'm his father," Julian said quietly, crossing the room to kneel beside them both. Kai looked up at the sound of his voice, and something in the boy's face shifted. Recognition, longing, the particular joy of a child who has been told, in careful and gentle ways, that this man loved him even when he could not always be near. "Papa," Kai whispered, reaching for him. and Julian pulled his son into his arms as though he might never let go again. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The storm outside had begun to weaken, the worst of it passing as quickly as it had come. Elena sat in the wreckage of the cottage, arm throbbing, mind still catching up to everything that had just happened, and watched a father hold his son like he'd nearly lost him. "You should have told me," she said finally, though there was no anger in it, only exhaustion. "If I'd known someone might come for him." "I know," Julian said. "I know, and I'm sorry. I thought hiding the truth was the only way to keep him safe. I didn't think about what it might cost the person watching over him, if the truth ever found its way here anyway." Elena looked down at Kai, who had fallen half asleep against his father's shoulder, despite everything, exhausted and finally, truly safe. "It doesn't matter what he is," she said. "It never did. He's just a little boy who needed someone to sit with him when he was scared. That's all I ever saw." Julian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. He had spent years building walls after losing Kai's mother, trusting almost no one with the truth of who his son was, convinced that love only ever made a person easier to hurt. But here was a woman who had stood unarmed against real danger for a child she'd believed was simply orphaned, who had never once needed the truth to know that protecting him was worth everything. "Thank you," he said simply, because there were no words large enough for what he actually meant. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, though not all at once. Julian began staying longer at the estate, no longer needing to hide his visits behind careful excuses. Priscilla, confronted with what her decision that night had nearly cost, was quietly removed from any position of authority over the household. And Elena, who had once made herself small and invisible on purpose, found herself, for the first time in years, being seen, not just by Kai, who had already loved her without needing a reason, but by his father, who had begun to understand that the walls he'd built to keep his son safe had also kept out the one person who'd proven, without hesitation, that she would guard that child with everything she had. It was months later, in the great hall of Julian's household, surrounded by people who had waited a long time to meet the heir they'd only heard rumors of, that Julian stood before his people with Kai's small hand in one of his, and Elena's hand in the other. "This is my son," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "And this is the woman who stood between him and danger without knowing who he was, because to her, it was never about bloodlines or titles. It was about a child who needed protecting. I owe her a debt I can never fully repay, so I am not repaying it. I am asking her to stay, not as a debt settled, but as family, for as long as she'll have us." Elena, who had spent 3 years believing that being unseen was the safest way to live, stood in that hall with a little boy's hand in hers, and a man looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd stopped believing he'd ever find, and understood, finally, that she did not have to disappear to be safe. She only had to be exactly who she already was. The storm had passed. What remained, standing together in the quiet after, was something steadier and far harder to break.